Peter Hartman with Renewable Now, and welcome to part 2 of our series from Rhode Island College with the Environmental Council of Rhode Island as we talk about green spaces and green energy. How do we let them coexist? How do we permit some of that energy into space that maybe before was preserved as open land? And certainly if you have not seen part 1, we encourage you to do that because I think we set the stage for some of the discussion that will happen now with the panelists that will get into maybe some of the more specific recommendations on how we move forward.
I think so, Peter. What the first panel pointed out is that a lot of what's happening in renewables, whether it's solar, wind, and we didn't even talk about hydro yet, to touch on that, it's all incremental. And so when things happen incremental, sometimes we wind up getting all tied up in a knot, and perhaps it's a Gordian knot. And I think in the second session of this program tonight, the second panel, maybe things are not so knotty. Maybe they figured out how to untie the knot, or to show us a pathway of moving forward on this whole issue.
You know, we spent a lot of time talking about government, right? But there's issues around economics, finance, and where ultimately the financial return is best. So I will let you start the process for part 2. Thank you for being with us, and we will start with the panel.
Well, since Peter mentioned government, I think that the two of you represent good government. I need my glasses for this. We have with us for the second part, Jeanne Boyle, who's Director of Commerce for the City of Pawtucket, and Kaitlin Kelly from the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. And lo and behold, they have pictures for us. Pictures! Take it away.
So I am now the Director of Commerce for the City of Pawtucket. Previously, I was the Planning Director for the City of East Providence, and I'm going to talk about a project that I was involved in when I was working in East Providence. I've only been in Pawtucket for about 4 months, so my memory of East Providence is still pretty vivid. The project was the Forbes Street Solar Project. We had some conversations in the last panel about how to properly site solar projects. This was the largest ground-mounted solar project in Rhode Island. It still is, which tells you something about the difficulties associated with siting ground-mounted solar projects. The Forbes Street project was basically a dormant, blighted property that the city repositioned into a solar project. It consisted of about 220 acres, 70 of which had been used as a landfill between 1970 and 1980. It was basically household waste that was used there. It wasn't a super fun site, but still it was challenging as to what we were going to do with the property. We did a number of environmental studies, and the conclusion that was reached ultimately was that the best, most appropriate use was for renewable energy. It was a long, involved process, however. The first step was to actually identify in our comprehensive plan that renewable energy was the most appropriate use. Then the city issued an RFP seeking renewable energy developers. And we got a good response. We got developers from all over the country responding to our RFP. We selected a firm known as CME Hecate, and they had done a number of projects, solar projects and other energy projects throughout the country and also internationally. What they proposed to do on the 70 acres that had been used as landfill out of the 220 was to actually construct a 6 to 12 megawatt solar installation. And the cost was estimated $40 to $50 million. We negotiated a development agreement with them in 2010, and this gave them the ability to move forward with the due diligence that was necessary to get the financing together and to find out whether this was actually a project that was feasible. Now, one thing that I'd like to emphasize is that the city had never properly closed the landfill. We had 70 acres, but it was never properly closed. So we were seeking to get a partner to assist us in the closure of the landfill. And it was in a sensitive area. Even though East Providence is an urban community, there were it was an area of high groundwater and extensive wetlands, and the people in that area were very concerned that anything that took place there was not going to have negative effects upon their properties and also upon some of the kind of natural environment. So we wanted to be sure that there was going to be sufficient setbacks, and also that some of the, there was basically wildlife and other natural considerations that we had to be concerned about. So one of the things that we worked with the developer, and we worked with the Department of Environmental Management to make sure that we addressed runoff and drainage. We planted, the landfill was going to be planted with grasses. We looked at a very complex and involved stormwater management process, developing the ring roadway actually served as part of our stormwater management approach, and we also had to stay away from the wetlands and the recharge areas that occupied a good portion of the 220 acres. So we made sure that we adopted best management practices in the design. Cost-wise, it was not a project that was easy to make work. At the time when we first started this, a lot of the tax credits and a lot of the programs that were available for development of renewables were not in place. So we struggled with trying to make this a project that was financially viable. We worked with the developer, we worked with the state, and we worked with the federal government to find a number of different federal grants that were available, and we were very successful. We obtained probably close to $1 million in assorted different federal and state grants to offset just the pre-development costs. We were also fortunate that shortly after we embarked upon this project, the state of Rhode Island changed its regulations and adopted the distributed generation legislation, and this really created a mechanism by which there was going to be a market for the renewables for this particular project. That really was instrumental in making this a financially viable project. The city didn't want to be in the business of developing solar, so we wanted to just be the landlord. So we entered into a long-term lease and actually were able to get, over a 30-year period, close to $100,000 a year in lease payments, a combination of lease payments and also performance payments from the developer. We still, though, had the responsibility, since it was our landfill, to Rhode Island DEM to assure them that the landfill was closed properly. So we had to have a division of responsibilities between the developer and between the city as to how the closure was going to be dealt with. But it was the responsibility for CME and Hecate to work with National Grid to go through the whole process of obtaining the distributed generation contract and also making sure that the financials were taken care of. We had a lot of conversations in our last panel about the zoning process. At the time, there was absolutely no zoning in place in East Providence for solar. We actually created a new solar ordinance that required them to go before the planning board and to establish a master plan for approval of the overall project. So they received master plan approval for a 9-megawatt solar facility, which gave them the ability to develop the entire project over time. Ultimately, the project was constructed by a third party and then sold to a second developer. Another thing that made this possible to go forward was we were able to strike a deal with the Department of Transportation, and we received 50,000 cubic yards of clean fill material. The cost of that, if we had to purchase the 50,000 cubic yards to cover the landfill, would have been in excess of $1 million. So the city was very fortunate. This is another factor that made this a financially viable project. And it was also something that was challenging because the Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management had never done a solar project on a landfill before. So we were working with Rhode Island DEM and kind of, working together to sort of invent how this was going to be regulated. So there was some trial and error on the part of the city, on the part of the developer, and also on the part of DEM. But I think we all shared the same goal, that we knew that closing this landfill, developing this renewable energy was something that we wanted to see accomplished. We also used a lot of in-house crews. We used DPW crews to spread a lot of the soil and also in combination with CME. So covering approximately 40 acres of basically bare dirt in about a 12-month period of time was an absolutely enormous task. The outcome was that we had over 13,000 panels installed. The total project cost for just this phase was $10 million, and it generated 3.7 megawatts. By 2013, it was generating electricity. And it also created a fair number of construction jobs, as well as 3 permanent jobs. So the actual installation of the solar facility happened pretty quickly. Once we got the landfill capped and covered, then they were able to basically bring them in by boxes. This was a ballasted construction, so they brought in concrete ballasts and then placed the solar panels on top of it. So you can see how quickly it progressed. So this was over approximately a 3-month period that the actual solar installation was put into place. So there it is, and by the end of the period of time, it was generating enough to power about approximately 8,000 households in the city of East Providence. So in terms of the next steps, the city is actually, because we had the master plan in place, CME Hecate was actually able to move forward pretty quickly for the next phase. They expect to have another 4 megawatts in place by 2018. The permitting process was much simpler, and but we are still responsible to DEM to complete the closure of the remaining 30 acres of the landfill. So it's been a real success story, and it's still the largest ground-mounted solar facility in the state of Rhode Island, and it didn't require basically the removal of acres and acres of pristine woodlands or farmland. Just by way of explanation, however, the city's zoning ordinance does not allow ground-mounted solar anywhere except on this particular site, because even in an urban community, we do recognize that a solar facility really represents what is essentially a land cannibal. And in a built-up community such as East Providence, we also want to preserve the opportunity for commercial development and industrial development. However, the city does allow rooftop solar as of right and also solar canopies as of right. So there is always going to be that balancing act between encouraging development such as this in a location like this, which is appropriate, and also making sure that we don't have it take up space that is otherwise needed for development or other purposes.
Jeanne, thank you very much. That was an extremely wonderful story, and certainly you and the city of East Providence waved your magic wand and created some wizardly things. So thank you very much. I know I have a number of questions. I'm sure other people do as well. Next up, because we know that we're not all that smart, and we have to look elsewhere for answers, we welcome Kaitlin Kelly from the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, our wonderful neighbor to the north, to help us lead the way. Kaitlin?
Thank you. So I'm Kaitlin Kelly. I'm Renewable Energy Program Coordinator at the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources. And it's great to be here this evening because the conversations and questions that you have right now about siting in Rhode Island, we've been having these same conversations in Massachusetts for the past year plus. So we've come up with what we think is a good solution for solving these issues in terms of siting and balancing environmental conservation and getting more renewable energy sources sited in the state. It's a little complex, but it's a complex issue, so we'll see how well it works. Just a quick overview of the evolution of land use policy in Massachusetts solar incentive programs. Basically, our first solar incentive program was the SREC 1 program, and that ran from about 2010 to 2014. We built about 653 megawatts of solar under the SREC 1 program, and we had no land use policy. Basically, we had one single flat incentive for every single project that was built, no matter the size, no matter where it was sited. they were all equally eligible. So when we created the SREC 2 program that is still running, we started in about 2014, we did try to craft some sort of land use policy into, excuse me, really was into the design of the incentives themselves. So what we did is we created market sectors, and projects fell into different market sectors based on where they were located and what the design of the project was. And we had higher incentives for prioritized sites, and we called them SREC factors. We also had a market sector called managed growth, and that was specifically for large ground-mounted virtually net metered projects that we put into this managed growth category. It was a capped category of 126 megawatts, and it also received the lowest incentive. However, what we couldn't anticipate was that we put the highest incentive for community shared solar and low-income housing projects, and that received the highest incentive was not subject to the cap of managed growth, and they're mostly large ground-mounted, virtually net metered projects. So while we were happy to see the growth of community solar and low-income housing projects in the state, we didn't do so great in terms of limiting the growth and development of large ground-mounted solar. So last year, when we started the process of designing the new incentive program, which we call the SMART program, the Solar Massachusetts Renewable Target Program, the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which is the secretariat that DOER exists under, basically directed us to really strongly focus on developing a land use policy in this solar program, because we have sister agencies under EEA who are trying to conserve land, trying to reduce clear cutting, and we were seeing a lot of projects that were being built on clear-cut land because of the high solar incentives that we were providing. Again, good for developing solar, not so good for limiting the impact of clear-cutting land. So we've come up with kind of a both incentive and disincentive approach under the SMART program. So we've established land use categories with associated incentive subtractors, category 1, 2, 3, and we also have prohibited land types under the SMART program, so certain types of land you cannot build on and receive an incentive. We also have incentive adders for priority sites, and we also are implementing land use performance standards. So on the incentive side, we have location-based adders that are basically an additional incentive you can receive for particular types of projects. So we have adders for landfills and brownfields, rooftops, solar parking canopies, agricultural generation units, and floating solar, or photovoltaics, as one developer called it. We've also created adders for other types of projects. We have off-taker-based adders, location adders, a storage adder, and you can combine them. You can have a location-based adder, an off-taker-based adder, and a storage adder, and you can kind of add it all up. So we're trying to encourage developers to always consider location in terms of the types of project you're building. You don't just have to build a community solar project. You can build a community solar project that's sited on a landfill or a brownfield. And we worked with our sister agencies, we will work with them in approving projects on unique locations. So brownfield projects, we work with the Department of Environmental Protection on approving those sites. Agricultural projects, we are working with the Department of Agricultural Resources. And floating solar, we're working with the Department of Environmental Protection and the Department of Fish and Wildlife in approving those project sites. In addition to the incentive-based policy, we also have a disincentive. So we have a greenfield subtractor that basically subtracts a certain amount off the base incentive rate that a project receives if it falls into certain land use categories. So these are just the different adders that are eligible under the SMART program. As you can see, we have a number of location-based adders. The highest go to solar canopy and agricultural, but we also, you just get a little more if you're building on a rooftop. You get a little more if you're building on a brownfield or landfill, or for floating solar. And again, if you're building a project, you can do one location-based adder, one off-taker-based adder, and also add some battery storage to really try to maximize the total incentive that you're receiving. Under the SMART program, we also are trying to encourage some unique designs. So we do have this new dual-use category for agricultural generation units, which was the topic of discussion in the first panel. So basically the idea is you are building solar PV on working farmland, but you're building it so that it doesn't interfere with the continued use of the land. You would essentially have raised structures, space to allow crops to grow, animals to graze, and because this is a new idea, if you are building this type of project, there is a requirement that you provide annual reports on the agricultural productivity to MDAR. We are developing further guidance with MDAR in this. There's also currently a pilot project at the University of Amherst right now that's being funded by NREL. So we've definitely been working closely with them because they're actually studying which types of crops are the best types of crops to grow if you have solar panels that are impacting the shading. You know, maybe sheep don't graze that well, but are there other types of animals that you can graze below solar panels? We also have the adder for floating solar. Again, this is a newer type of installation. We've certainly seen it in other countries. So again, it's new. We wanted to be cautious in our approach to this, so the only eligible projects are installed on bodies of water that are basically used for agricultural or industrial activities, so water treatment facilities. We have a number of cranberry bogs in Massachusetts, and they often have ponds where they hold the floodwaters for the bog. It's prohibited on natural water bodies or wetland resource areas. And again, those projects will have to receive specific approval, both from DOER and from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection. So this is just going through our land use categories. Basically, Category 1 land use is the priority land use. So if you fall under Category 1, you've received no greenfield subtractor to your base incentive rate. And we actually divided Category 1 into agricultural and non-agricultural. So if you're building a project and it's located on land, we define it as land in agricultural use or prime agricultural farmland. If you don't want to receive a subtractor, you have to build an agricultural dual-use unit. You have to do building mounted. Or if they're sized to meet no greater than 200% of the annual operational load of an agricultural facility. And that actually pairs with the current requirements on farms that receive an incentive, a tax incentive under Massachusetts. They do have the ability to build renewable generation on the farm, but there is the limit that it can't be sized to meet more than 200% of the load. Then we have Category 1 non-agricultural, so if it's not on farmland. Basically, smaller generation units, if it's ground mounted at 500 kW or less. If it's greater than 500 kW, if it's being built on land that was previously developed, or land that is zoned as a solar overlay district or for power generation, then you will not receive a subtractor. And again, if you're building on our priority locations and sites, a building, brownfield, landfill, parking canopy, floating solar generation unit, you don't receive a subtractor. Category 2 will receive what we call the half greenfield subtractor. So basically, if you're building on land where it has been zoned for commercial and industrial use, but it hasn't been previously developed, you will get some subtraction to your base incentive rate, but not as much as if you fall into Category 3, which is basically all other project types. If you're building on land that has been classified as Article 97 land, unless it meets Category 1, it is ineligible. Article 97 is permanently protected open space land in Massachusetts. Also, again, if you're building in a wetland resource area, unless the local conservation commission has approved the design of the project, it's an ineligible land use. Also, we have historical register sites, except as authorized by the local historic commission. And you'll notice that a number of the categorizations depend on whether land has been previously developed or not. So we define previously developed as having pre-existing paving, construction, altered landscapes, but not alterations resulting from agricultural use, forestry, or use as a preserved natural area. We've gotten questions that say, well, this piece of land, it just happens to be clear cut. Isn't that previously developed? No, that's not previously developed. That's clear-cut forest. We don't want you to build there. You know, if there's just an easement for power lines that's not previously developed. But if there's a parking lot that's been built there, if it's a developed site with buildings, then yes, that we do consider that previously developed. So again, the way that the subtractor will be applied is actually, we measure the size of the panels themselves. So the square footage of the physical panels will be translated into an acreage impact. So that's how the subtractor is applied to the total base incentive for the project. In addition to the land use categories, we've also implemented these land use performance standards. So these apply to all ground-mounted projects, whether or not they fall into Category 1 or Category 3. They must comply with the following performance standards. So there's no removal of all field soils. Existing leveled field areas are left as is without disturbance. Where soils need to be leveled and smoothed, basically done with minimal overall impact, and all displaced soils have to be returned to the areas affected. We're requiring ballasts, screw type, or post-driven pilings, or other methods with minimal soil impact, or any soil penetrations that may be required for the foundation. Basically, I won't read through them all, but the basic point of all these performance standards is to try to disturb the soil as little as possible. As we were discussing in panel 1, the soil is important. I mean, when you put a solar panel, when you put a solar project on a site, it's going to be there for 30 years. But we want to maintain the integrity of the soil at all possible, because that could be soil that is used for growing trees 50 years in the future, for growing our future food. And we really want to try to limit the impact on the soil itself. So just for next steps, you can see our regulations. They are fully in effect, even though the program hasn't officially started. We are currently developing further guidance, so we'll have separate guidelines in addition to the regulations on land use categorization, and we'll be releasing those for comment in the coming weeks. The program will go into effect next year, likely around late spring 2018. But we have actually just taken one of the big first steps in the development of the program. Earlier this week, the initial 100 megawatt competitive procurement to start the program was released. And it's actually only ground-mounted projects that can respond to this competitive procurement, to this RFP. If they are projects that are seeking adders, they're not eligible. So we're really going to see at the basic level the impact of these policies on the price of the projects that are bidding in. Because the results of this RFP will be used to set the price for the rest of the program. So the results will be announced on January 11th, and at that point, we'll set the program prices for the initial block for the rest of the program when it opens up next year. Thank you.
Kaitlin, we thank you. I know Brian had mentioned that, cities and towns are copying the renewable energy ordinances from other cities and towns, also copying their mistakes. Seems like you don't have very many mistakes, if any. You did a heck of a job. So I have a quick question for you, quick question for Jeanne, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Do cities and towns in Massachusetts, do they have renewable energy ordinances? And if so, how does that then dovetail with what your office is doing now?
They do. So the way that dovetails with the policy as we designed it is as I said, if it's being sited on land that was specifically zoned by the city or town for solar development or for power generation, then it's category 1, you don't receive a greenfields attracted because the town identified this property as the place where it wanted power generation to be built, for solar to be built. We do have a division in the DOER that's called the Green Communities Division. So they actually work with cities and towns on developing solar ordinances. A lot of it is by right, solar zoning. But we have 351 cities and towns. They all have different laws.
Okay. And Jeanne, you had mentioned that you had a number of bidders in response to your request for proposals. Was it the time not a time of the year, but was it at that time in the whole development of renewable energy facilities, or was it the scale of what East Providence was looking for that attracted the number of responses?
I think it was a combination of both, although I think there weren't too many communities that were offering 70 acres for renewables.
That's what I was talking about,
I
scale.
think the scale was unusual. But we were looking for qualifications at that time. So I think that what was happening is that a lot of companies were getting into renewables at the time, didn't necessarily have the project completely vetted as to whether or not it was financially viable. So when we were selecting, we really took a look at who had actually done these projects and had the capability to pull it together. So I think it was pretty easy to weed out 3 or 4 of the respondents to know that they really weren't going to be able to do a viable project.
Thank you.
So Ken, the good news is we have about 15 minutes for questions. We promise to get you out on time. While you start to raise your hand, and I will come over to you. In Massachusetts, big difference than Rhode Island. You have a lot of grids, and you have an SREC program. I think for a while you actually shut down new renewables, right, for a period of time. I don't know if you met a saturation point or seemed as though there was a slowdown in Massachusetts. But tell us about versus Rhode Island with a dominant grid. Do you think it's a little bit easier because you have co-ops, you have a lot of diversity? Interconnect rates, are they more competitive? And how do you think the SRECs influence what's going to happen under this new program?
Well, I think if you talk to any solar developer, they will say that interconnection in Massachusetts is not easy. We've heard increasingly that
Why is that?
Interconnection costs are going up, especially as grid saturation has increased. Now projects are being sited in places where you have to do more substantial upgrades to the grid itself, and all those interconnection costs are passed on to the developer. And also in Massachusetts, it is difficult, and I know that we've talked about this here because we have a concentration of load in the Boston area, but there's no land. And then in Western Massachusetts, there's land, but there's also not a lot of three-phase power. So there's difficulty there. Under the next program, we are actually going to, this is really getting into the weeds, but we are proposing a new method of net metering specifically for the next program so that, because right now we basically have 3 main utility companies. We have Eversource, which is NSTAR in Western Massachusetts. We have National Grid, like here in Rhode Island, and then we have Unitil, which is kind of up north. But you can't pass energy credits across load zones. So South Massachusetts can't go to North Massachusetts.
But you have direct virtual net metering. You have people in Back Bay that are buying clean energy in Western Mass, right?
No.
No?
No. And that's part of I think we have many solar developers that would love that, but we don't, because we have, that crosses 3 utility service territories, and that crosses the load zone. So under SMART, now, we still have the issue where you can't allocate credits and energy across utility service territories, but you can cross load zones. So we're trying to get to that. But, there's definitely a lot of other challenges for Massachusetts itself. And for the SREC program, I think the transition from SRECs to SMART, a lot of it is education because it's a different type of program. We're going from a market-based incentive program to really what's essentially a feed-in tariff program. So it's structured very differently.
So you'll be a little bit more like Rhode Island.
Exactly.
Because your credit market vacillated quite a bit, right?
It did, but we'll see how this works.
No, keep going while I walk over there.
So, I think investors, financiers, and also just people are, it's amazing how knowledgeable residents are about SREC markets and about SRECs in general. That will be a new structure. But really, once SMART begins, the SREC program will end. So we will no longer be qualifying systems under that program.
Thank you.
My question or my thought, just put it out there, it comes from the first panel, but also since you're from Pawtucket, it also spurred my interest. We do a lot in Rhode Island, and politicians seem to jump at the chance of, a new business is going to bring jobs in. But the history is that none of those jobs truly really materialize or stay there very long, like even your project wound up with just a few permanent jobs. So why don't we have a more assertive approach to new businesses coming in that includes incentives and tax breaks if they participate in renewable programs? So one issue right now in Pawtucket is a new stadium. Not going to produce really a lot of high-paying jobs, but it could benefit the citizens not only of Pawtucket, but of Rhode Island if they paneled the stadium with solar panels and really participated in a real effort to bring renewables to Rhode Island. And so with Amazon also, when we talk about it's hard to get a new landlord to put panels on top of their building, well, Amazon, if we're going to say you want to come here, we'll give you tax breaks, we'll give you incentives. Where are you as far as renewables? Will you work with us on that?
Well, now with my Pawtucket hat on, we have actually had conversations with the PawSox on the stadium project about using renewables, and we've actually had conversations about doing solar canopies in the parking lots. And some of the conversations have also taken place with the Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank. There are programs available through Rhode Island Infrastructure Bank to actually fund some of the renewables. So that's absolutely been a priority, and actually Ken and I have had some conversations as well along those lines. So there is an expectation that that's going to be, to the extent possible, using renewables. In addition to the stadium project, I don't know if you're aware that in Pawtucket we're also developing a new transit-oriented development district. And that's also going to be one of the high priorities, is to make that also as much a spot where we have zero net energy use as possible. So we're looking to incorporate that into some of our zoning regulations, the use of solar canopies, encouragement of, we've got an awful lot of rooftops in Pawtucket and Central Falls in that TOD district. And how are we going to encourage that and facilitate that? So when we're working with potential developers, I don't know if it's going to be Amazon, we certainly are hopeful, but regardless of whatever developers come in there, we do want to make sure that this is a priority. So we're looking at a regulatory approach as well as possibly looking at commercial incentives. So absolutely, that's at the forefront of our planning.
Jeannie, did you say that in East Providence you do not have additional permitting for ground mount systems?
Yes, we do. What happens is that we do not allow ground-mounted solar other than at Forbes Street. So what they were able to do,
Why?
Because there's very little land available for development in a built-up community like East Providence. So even though we're not talking about farmland, we're talking about a scarcity of developable land.
But don't you have industrial parks buildings that could be ripped down because they're obsolete, that could potentially be replaced by renewables?
Or replaced by other development. Right now, there's actually a shortage of viable industrial space. So what we do is for roof-mounted solar, that's allowed as of right. And also solar canopies are allowed as of right. AAA has constructed a solar canopy as part of their new facility on the Wampanoag Trail. So we're trying to encourage that. So if somebody were to come in and propose a ground-mounted solar in a location in East Providence, they would have to go through a more rigorous permitting process.
Raise your hand if you want me to come over, and while I walk over. So in Massachusetts, really quick, does it make sense, though, to look at, if you had really low-grade wetlands areas, would renewables be friendly and feasibly developed? No, I heard somebody in the audience. Go ahead.
I think that would be left up to the local conservation commission to decide. So if it's in a wetlands resource area, if you're siting in there, you have to be within the buffer zone as approved by the local Concom. So it's really up to local authority to decide that, actually.
Okay.
Yes, you had said that you were in discussion with Pawtucket as far as their transportation expansion that they're doing. Have you had any talks with RIDOT as discussing Providence with their possibility of the expansion where the Amtrak train station is and an intermodal facility there? Have you?
We haven't had any conversations with RIDOT about what's going on in Providence, but RIDOT is basically the partner with the cities of Pawtucket and Central Falls for the new intermodal. So so they are actually in charge of the design and development of the new MBTA stop that's coming into Pawtucket and Central Falls. There's also going to be a RIPTA bus hub. So so that they are part of the whole. They are selecting the construction firm that's going to be doing the MBTA stop. So we're definitely working with them.
About 5 minutes left.
Kaitlin, does your state have additions for experimental forms of renewable energy that can cover your holes, your night times, your cloudy days?
So we have the adder for battery storage. So we have a specific adder under the SMART program for PV paired with battery storage. And I can certainly give you some more information on that. We basically have designed the adder to be a variable adder, so it's actually variable based on the ratio of the battery capacity to the PV capacity and the duration of the battery itself. So we're trying to get more storage installed in general in Massachusetts. We did release an energy storage report, State of Charge, last year. So we actually have a goal to basically develop and install, I think it's about 400 megawatts of battery storage. But because we've put this as part of the PV incentive program, we'll see if this actually gets built, but according to the utilities, their whole interconnection queue is all PV paired with storage at the moment. So, we'll see how that pans out.
Kaitlin, I just had a question on that, kind of on that same theme, is that what the tariffs you described, this feed-in tariff that'll be in place with SMART, has some higher level adders for different types like PV plus storage. Mm-hmm. Is there an incentive then for the off-taker to pay, assuming the off-taker bears the cost of that additional adder and that feed-in tariff, to pay the additional amount that goes with that type of project versus a plain PV project, so that they get more credits for their renewable production standards, some other incentive they have to engage in that more costly project?
So for off-taker-based adders, under the SMART program, we actually separate, we have one feed-in tariff, but we separate the value of energy and the value of the incentive as paid to the generation unit owner. So for most off-taker-based adders, what they're actually receiving is an energy credit. So it's either a net metering credit, or we're calling this the alternative on-bill credit that we're proposing, that is being proposed at the DB right now with the smart tariff itself. So essentially the net metering credit value is currently regulated by statute. It's currently regulated by the legislature, and there are also caps on net metering, which is partially why we propose this alternative bill credit. The value of the alternative bill credit, we've proposed it to be set at basic service. So that would be the value that could be applied to an off-taker's bill. So they could offset their supply, essentially, the supply portion of their bill. If somebody owns a system outright, and they're installing behind the meter, just offsetting their energy use directly. We actually have a different way of calculating the incentive so that there is an estimation of the energy value that you're receiving, and then you get a fixed incentive payment rate. So as an off-taker, really they don't have any incentive to pay more. There's only a limited amount that they may be able to receive as a credit, because the developer is obviously trying to offer some sort of benefit to an off-taker. So if they have an 8 cent per kilowatt hour basic service, and that's the credit that they can apply to their bill, the developer will, they may say, well, I'll sell this to you for 6 cents, 7 cents. So because net metering credit values have declined, because this, that is a separate but similar conversation in terms of solar incentives, and net metering credits have significantly declined in Massachusetts, and we also have caps on them. Net metering credit offtake agreements, I don't believe will be as beneficial to offtakers, but offtakers will continue to be able to participate in community solar. You can have cities and towns having, large-scale PPAs under SMART as well.
Jeannie, real quick, and then we are going to finish up. You get the last word. I really like what happened in East Providence when I think about this liability, right? This capped landfill turning into an asset producing, obviously, revenue. But as you think about your strategy there and now in Pawtucket, what is the pecking order for you in trying to develop renewables in a city and in a community? Is it around resilience and bringing energy local and keeping that within your borders? Is it around kind of fixing cost for energy going forward? Is it environmental? How do you rank those things, and as you look at projects and potential renewables in Pawtucket now?
I think in East Providence, I think probably the priority was more environmental. We had environmental liability, and we were really struggling with a way to deal with it. I think in Pawtucket, where the costs of development are, we're kind of at a margin. So using renewables as a way of making the development make sense is very important. I also think that it's important that we, especially in the transit-oriented development district, we're trying to position that as an area of innovation. And you really can't be an innovative area if you ignore your energy costs and if you ignore the use of renewables. When you have acres and acres of rooftops in a built-up area, and we're really not going to be relying on parking, it makes sense to make the use of renewables a priority, and to work with some of the existing businesses who are also, operating at a very thin margin and encouraging them to use renewables. So I do think that renewable energy as both an environmental tool and also an economic tool is really the priority in Pawtucket.
So thank you both. You did a wonderful job. And so for the live audience, you did a wonderful job too. Thank you so much for your participation. We hope you enjoyed the night. And for those of you who are at home watching, we will be right back with some closing thoughts with Ken, and we're going to have a rep from the Environmental Council of Rhode Island to help us wrap up. We'll be right back.
What's the price of a gallon of gas? Depends where you live. It's one thing here in Louisiana. It's another in the tar sands of Alberta. And it's something else in the skies over Los Angeles. That price at the pump is only part of the story. Please, tell your senators to vote for clean energy and climate legislation now. And then if you can, lend a hand to our friends on the Gulf Coast. After all, they're the ones paying the highest price for a gallon of gas.
Thanks so much for staying with us. We are here at Rhode Island College, finishing up with the Environmental Council of Rhode Island as we talk about and think about the future for siting renewables. Meg Kerr is with us from the Audubon Society of Rhode Island. Thank you so much for hosting tonight. Give us your thoughts. What are the things you walk away with tonight, Meg?
Well, I thought it was a great illustration of the complexities of the challenge of siting renewable energy, and that solutions really aren't impossible. So I liked the last two presentations. It was nice to hear from Jeanne Boyle that renewable energy is a priority as they look to do the development in Pawtucket. And thinking about the SMART program in Massachusetts and seeing whether there's some tidbits of insight that we can now apply in Rhode Island. So I think it was a great evening. Thank you very much.
Ken?
I think it showed the statewide imperative for moving forward on all this. And the other thing I'd like to just bring out, some sort of backroom structure to this whole thing, is that this is sort of a new initiative for the Environmental Council of Rhode Island. This started out of the policy committee and the executive committee, where it's, they do legislation, they do events, they do projects, but the discussion was what are the important subjects, the important issues and topics that we have to form and coalesce around and move the discussion further for positive solutions. So my hat's off to ECRI for what they've done on all this.
No, my hat's off too. And one of the things that stood out for me, we didn't get into too much, is public opinion. Public opinion, which side is it on? Paul gave me an example at the break of a great solar array they did, and it was on a hill. Everybody was happy except the people in the community across the way that were looking at it. And so there seems to be a lack, I think, of conviction that we are willing to be a home, that we are willing to house renewables, that we're willing to have turbines, small and large, in our backyard. And as much role as a government can play, I think it pales in comparison to our personal ambitions around the environment and around the economy and our adaptation for the new technology, and maybe that's something we can pick up soon on the radio side. Thank you so much for being with us here at Rhode Island College. Thank you, Meg, and the Environmental Council for hosting. Jim Murphy, thank you, and the staff at Rhode Island College. I'm Peter Oppen for Renewable Now and RNN, the show and the network that bring you the business side of green.
This is RNN, the Renewable Now network, where sustainability makes sense.